First, about the military flex that seems to be a big part of this administration's thing. Um, the Venezuelan interdictions, the kind of, I would say, almost snuff videos of the boats being blown up, the calling together of generals and admirals last week, the calling up of National Guard troops and demands that they show up in these liberal cities. It all seems of a kind. I wonder if you can put it in some kind of context and give me also the political price that might be paid for this, or maybe it's working politically for this administration.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark, because there are some threads that connect these, but I think it's also important to sort of break them down, especially because you asked me to do so sort of in a political context, all right? So let's take the first of those, the drug smuggling thing. By all accounts, that has been fairly well received by the public. Now, there's question marks people have about doing so in international waters. The most recent one apparently happened not that far off the Venezuelan coast. But there is strong public support for drug interdiction. I mean, the fentanyl crisis is now pretty much become a bipartisan concern. And there's a strong sense that it has not been well stopped over the last decade or so, that those numbers continue to grow. The deaths among young people continue to grow. And so the so-called status quo, keeping the drug cartels as they were, so to speak, has not been politically popular on either side of the aisle. It's like, we got to do something more. So this has been the Trump response. I think the real key to this, Mark, is going to be, does this become normative, or does in some way, some form, this begin to really stem the tide? I mean, there was $100 million drug bust in the last couple of weeks, the biggest one in U.S. history as part of all this. And, that's fairly politically popular. We'll see where it goes from here. As far as the generals coming together, people talked about how unusual that was. But what really got the headlines was, hey, we're not going to have any fat generals and fat admirals walking the halls of the Pentagon. And there was pretty widespread support for this notion of, hey, look, if you're going to ask they used to call them grunts, right? The American Army privates. If you're going to ask these guys to pass military, stringencies in terms of physicality, you can't have their top brass walking around look like they could barely get across the street. So there is some popular sort of leanings to that in terms of, look, up and down the chain of command, you got to toe the line. Now, the key, Mark, is going to be what is asked of that top brass going forward. Apart from their own physical, attributes, et cetera, is there a new emphasis that's going to come out of this? Because what really came out of it was, hey, you're going to toe the line and everybody else is going to toe the line. There's not going to be any exceptions anymore. And then the last thing, the ICE deal, is really particularly interesting because, Mark, what's really happening now, and there's not clarity about who those two individuals, as you rightly point out, were, but what's happened, I think, that's become a big challenge for ICE is the wanting to add 50,000 new officers, remember. Many of them recruit out of local law enforcement around the country. And when you're moving that quickly to integrate that many new bodies into any kind of a law enforcement force, there's going to be challenges. And certainly they're facing those now.
I want to go back just for a second to the admirals and generals being collected. The idea somehow that, and of course I wouldn't argue because you're so good on politics, like if that's what people really took away from it for the most part, as you're seeing and, in various polling and, you kind of have your hand on the political pulse. If what you're seeing is that they took away that there are not going to be any more fat admirals and fat generals, then I wonder why the F you need to collect everybody from all around the world just to tell them that, all of a sudden we're going to ask you guys to do push-ups twice a year and evaluate your physical stature or whatever. But here is a little of the reaction, because it was about also, it seemed, heavily geared toward anti-wokeism and the idea somehow that, we're a soft service before, we're not going to be a soft service anymore. There's sort of a suggestion that women integrated into the military. We know Hegseth's general disposition toward that has somehow weakened the force. It doesn't seem to be the truth based on what I'm hearing and seeing from general after general. Play a little bit of this, Tony. This is from over the weekend.
You kill people and break things for a living. In this profession, you feel comfortable inside the violence so that our citizens can live peacefully. Lethality is our calling card, and victory our only acceptable end state.
What do you think that means?
Well, first of all, it's not connected to the reality of how these things happen, how wars are won. First of all, the political leadership has to describe the end state. What is it we're going to do? Why are we sending troops somewhere? What are they supposed to accomplish? And usually it's not going to be by killing everybody in sight. So I think there's a disconnect between this idea that it's all about lethality and that we kill people and break things. That's not the mantra of any Army unit I was ever in 38 years. It was always about accomplish the mission that was assigned to us, carry out every lawful order, and do it in such a way that protects civilians and ensures that all of our soldiers are protected and come back home safe. This idea of break things and kill people, that's what the Russians did in Bucha and Mariupol. That's not who we are. We're the soldiers of a free, democratic country.
It is true. I thought this stuck out to me because I thought this really is true that, when the Americans move in, the American soldiers, historically, this goes all the way back to World War II. There's a sense, maybe it's just implied, there's certainly exceptions like the My Lai massacre, and there are exceptions all along the way. There are even exceptions out of Afghanistan and Iraq. I can point to them. I mean, soldiers who were actually brought up on charges, et cetera. But there is a sense that the Americans are not the troops who are going to come in and just lay waste wantonly to areas of the world. They answer to a higher moral code. And what I got from the Hegseth talk was the old America. Now we're all about the lethality, et cetera. And there was a roughness and a coarseness to his message.
Well, I think you've hit on something important, Mark, and that was his tone. There are 10 specific points. We don't have time to go down each one of them today, probably. 10 specific points that he laid out for the generals. My point earlier was simply that the takeaway from many of the headlines and the lead stories and much of the broadcast news was the fat generals and admirals. That's what I think a lot of the American public initially took away. But if you look at those 10 points, really my sense about it was that the Trump/Hegseth approach to our now Department of War, formerly Department of Defense, is the pendulum swung too far over this way. There's the old trope about, well, we're not going to be nation building, right? That's not what a military does, is so-called nation building. That's for the State Department to think about. What we need to do is we're working on boots on the ground, planes in the sky, ships on the sea. Ours is about physical security. And when need be, physical, assertion. So that's, I think, the pendulum that Hegseth wants to move the other direction, the sense that the military, and by the way, it's not just when it comes to human assets, as they call them, but this is a big part of the larger military rehab that's going on in terms of shipbuilding, for example, a sense that we are way behind the Chinese in shipbuilding capacity, submarine building, a whole host of things, next-gen fighters, which is why you saw that rolled out this year. So there's a sense that across the board, Mark, that American military strength and power has waned. And all the top military analysts will affirm that in a variety of ways. And I think what you're seeing Hegseth do with the generals and the admirals was, look, this also has a human component, and this is what it is.
All the top military analysts will affirm the fact that the American military fighting force has lost a step or is losing to some of the other superpowers that you've mentioned, China among them?
What they would say, Mark, is at the margin, how we used to be sort of head and shoulders above, right? And it's not that we're in a weakened position vis-a-vis, we're subservient to another nation militarily. It's at that margin of American exceptionalism when it came to our military has diminished. Okay, it's not as wide as it has been, and so it's that trend line that has concerned military planners over particularly the last decade or so.
I'm going to talk about politics here and general politics, and a really interesting, provocative notion for the Democratic Party in a second. But just to round this off, it struck me as a wildly noticeable absence that he was so busy with this, what I consider total crap about the admirals and generals being heavy. You know, it's a desk job being an admiral and general oftentimes, and you are now with the new technologies that are oftentimes used to, I shouldn't say oftentimes, always used to deal with these armed conflicts. You're not out there running around. I mean, these are guys in their 60s, a lot of them. They've been on in the theaters of war. But I just want to say the one thing missing was talking about cybersecurity, talking about new technologies. This is really where national security, I think, is so very relevant to the modern age. Instead, we got hooked on battleships, and then Trump gets up, and I don't know if he seemed drunker than Hegseth did to me. So again, these are my views. I obviously come from an extreme position. I know you are far more neutral, but to me, I thought, in a way, the significant things left the building, technologies, et cetera, and what we ended up with was just kind of like a weird frat boy TED Talk. I want to ask you about...
Can I say two quick things, Mark, about that?
Please, yeah.
I think you're exactly right when it comes to the technological and cyber warfare component. My sense is, and what's been interesting, is that Hegseth and Trump don't talk about that very much. I think part of it, from what you hear internal the Pentagon, that is purposeful. That stuff has a very sort of hush-hush component to it, particularly when it comes vis-a-vis the Chinese. And they don't want to sort of show their hand about what we are working on. But I'd say the comparison harkens back to the top brass, to the Pattons of the world, the Eisenhowers, the MacArthurs, right, who were all quote-unquote fit generals. And so the comparison is to some of those more recent, in terms of the last half-century military American heroes.
Okay, I don't want to go round and round. Patton probably was fine in his 40s. I think in his 60s, he was probably a heavier dude. All right, I don't know, maybe not.
As a matter of fact, he was not.
He was not? Okay, well,
he was not.
You clearly know. So I do want to talk about the Democratic Party and the crisis of conscience that they're having, meaning, what it is our move? How do we reconstitute either our message or our party itself? How do we bring in the left that can be really left, the mainstreamers, some of whom, at least from the voting standpoint, actually voted for Donald Trump or punched the Republican ticket in this last general election, and even in some of the down ticket elections? This is, as you've pointed out to me off the air, this is a crisis that, meaning a political crisis that the Democratic Party has faced before.
Yeah, I think for those of us who are old enough to remember the Reagan years, post the Jimmy Carter years, it was during the 1980s when the Reagan Revolution, quote unquote, was underway, and the Republican ascendancy, as you know, politically, Mark, really skyrocketed. I mean, that's when the 1984 election was a political massacre. I mean, that's when Reagan won a huge landslide in the Electoral College, so much so that Walter Mondale won only, remember, his own state of Minnesota. And so that was, talk about a sea change and an introspective time. And that's what gave rise to Bill Clinton, who won in 1992 after a single term by Reagan's vice president, George Bush Sr. And there was a strong sense of, look, we can't just, because remember, it was in those days in the 1980s that the Reagan Democrat moniker came to be. This whole notion that Democrats could, especially blue-collar Democrats, especially men, could be wooed into the Republican fold. And in fact, they were. The numbers proved that. And so, there was this move towards the center. Here comes a governor from Arkansas, who, by the way, was the chairman of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council. That was seen as the moderate part of the party. And that is something now that people are looking at. Look, maybe this is the direction we need to go. That is not widely shared. And it wasn't then. It took several election cycles for this to really parse out which direction is the Democratic Party going to go. More back towards its liberal roots, which they perceived Jimmy Carter had somewhat abandoned, or is it going to go in this more moderate way? It eventually, with Al Gore and Bill Clinton, for 2 terms, led to that more moderate approach. And you can look at even a lot of the policy things they did, like workfare. the reforms to welfare, and a whole host of things that definitely moved the Democratic Party towards the middle. I think the difference now that's interesting that people are pointing out is where are the elected officials to take up the charge of that mantle? Because in those days, it was Clinton and a lot of other Southern and Midwest Democrats that helped lead that charge, who were part of that DLC movement. And people are saying, who are those folks going to be now? Or is it going to be a more progressive wing, which right now the voices, as you know, of reform in the party are on the progressive side. The Bernie Sanders, the AOCs, even the Gavin Newsoms, the Pritzkers, they are not moving the party so much towards the middle as they are saying we need to have a strong progressive pushback to Trump.
It's interesting, too, that if you look at the New Jersey political races, they are pointing to Josh Shapiro. I was reading a piece over the weekend about that. In other words, the success of certain kinds of Democratic leadership, and to the extent that that can be informative and instructive as to how you move forward, you know, what's working already in various parts of the country.
Yeah, and you know the concern in New Jersey is it's sort of under the radar here on the West Coast, but there's a New Jersey governor's race that's going to take place here in just a few weeks that many Democrats are very nervous about. I mean, Trump only lost New Jersey by 6 percentage points. That was down from 15 the presidential election cycle prior. And so people are saying, you know, the polls right now in New Jersey are a lot tighter than Democrats would like to be comfortable with. And I will tell you that if that Republican wins that race, that will be a massive sea change. Even if he comes within single digits, low single digits, that's going to be a real wake-up call, many Democrats say, for their own party.
Right, and so then that would have to be factored into the kind of conversation that you were just talking about. I want to ask you about the government shutdown, Gary. You've been through these before. This one seems so far to be maybe a little different. I'd argue that both sides seem to feel as though they are winning this politically, and the political part of it seems to be what they are preoccupied with. That's, again, because nobody's missed a check yet. You know what I mean? It's just we've just started. But there are real-world consequences. I mean, there are intense, grim consequences to the government shutdown. But I wonder if you can give me your political analysis as you look at things. Who is winning? Who might win? Who will likely be held responsible? I think you've mentioned before that usually, you know, the president, that party, the president's party, the one in power, is the one that usually ends up bearing the brunt of it. But I'm wondering, in this case, of course, the Republicans control all of Washington.
Well, here's the deal. New CBS News poll, fresh off we used to call it presses. We don't do that anymore. But fresh off the digital landscape, Mark, makes the problem in some ways worse. And here's why. Because there is not a clear loser right now in terms of the shutdown. Both parties being blamed. Okay, it's really remarkable. Now, Republicans get a slightly more of the blame. Okay, but it's basically a third, a third. Who bears more of the blame? The public says Republicans a third, Democrats a third, both parties equally a third. All right. Now, there's some variation. I think it's like 39% for Democrats and low 30s for Democrats. I mean, for Republicans and then Democrats. But that's not a big margin. It's not like you've got a 20, 25 point spread that would cause one party its knees to buckle. And that is part of the problem. You know, that there isn't a huge sort of, oh, you guys are the problem. You better get your act together today. That's part of it. Now, in terms of pressure points politically, there is one coming up. October 15th would be when the military paychecks come out. A lot of people don't know this, but those will not go out for service members if the shutdown is still occurring. A lot of folks inside the Beltway are saying that could be when things start really getting ugly, when the pressure really gets turned up. You cannot, on the one hand, hold a big rally of the top brass, and on the other hand say, oh, by the way, you're not getting paid, you average rank and file military folks, coming up here in just a little over a week.
Good stuff. Yeah, it kind of conforms with my view of America right now, which is that we're so dug in, we have information siloed ourselves to the point that it's always going to be their fault, whoever the there is, you know, Democrats, Republicans, Democrats, left to right, etc. So I don't know that there's a whole lot of objectivity anymore in evaluating these things, but I think your last point is so compelling. Yeah, you know, once these checks don't go out, the arithmetic begins to change and the heat goes up. Give me I know you're not a prediction guy, but give me your sense of how long you think it will go on. When do you think this will break? And we'll get government open again.
Let me preface by saying most folks in Washington think that the real pressure point, the actual political pressure point, is on Chuck Schumer and these 5 Democratic votes that are needed to move the already House passed version of a continuing resolution. Okay, it's just a kicking the can down the road, but it does so till about Thanksgiving, and that is passed the House. They keep voting it, taking votes on it in the Senate. It doesn't pass. There are 3 Democrats that have sided with that, 1 Republican, Rand Paul, that has not. But the pressure point is on Schumer to see whether he can hold his coalition together. But interestingly, Republicans are putting pressure on Democratic senators. They're going to have to run next year in states where they could be under real pressure. And so right now, that is seen as the most likely sort of fault line in all of this. I'm going to guess, Mark, that it probably goes another couple of weeks, but who knows? And again, I think really in another week or two, when those checks aren't going out and those people are being interviewed, at a military-based commissary, and they can't buy groceries because they haven't gotten their check, that's when I think you're going to see those stories begin to take top of headline power.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. Well, we learned a couple of things at minimum. One is that Patton was in really good shape all the way to the end.
Remember that he passed away somewhat early in his life, but the point of the matter is, guys like he, McCarthy, and Eisenhower, of course, went on to serve in the presidency. They did not get fat and happy.
No, that is true. Eisenhower was a slim, good-looking dude all the way to the end with all those medals. It was really quite impressive guy. All right. What was the other thing we learned? Oh, we learned a lot. I don't know, Gary. I learned a lot actually during this time. I think the whole idea of the Democrats in both crisis, but a crisis that has been visited upon them before. Looking for an identity that cuts through. I thought that was really instructive. So if you guys are just joining us, go back and watch that entire the conversation that we've had with Gary Dietrich. You can find him on iHeart Media, across the iHeart Radio network, also across the CBS television stations, and here on Mondays, our wonderful friend, Gary Dietrich. Thanks, pal.
Thanks, Mark. Have a great show.
Yeah, thanks so much. Gary is brought to us, as you know, every week by Bill Campbell at RE/MAX Gold. If you're relocating into or from Northern California, shout out to Northern California. You need a highly respected real estate agent. A professional like Bill Campbell can help you in your life. When it comes to real estate, it's Bill Campbell, RE/MAX Gold. Call or text him 530-448-7474, 530-448-7474. You can just ask him about the real estate market now, appraisals, decisions, moving, selling. Gary Dietrich, a great linkage to Bill Campbell at RE/MAX Gold. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.